Hello and welcome to a new video from Jörg, Juggler66, Hour of the Truth. This is already the next part in the reading The Secret History of the Jesuits, where we first gonna finish, of course, chapter 3 of the book The Real Odessa by Ukigoni, which is titled, this chapter, Undesirable Immigration, about how all around the world, especially of course here described in Argentina, but all around the world, during the time of the persecution of the Jews in Europe, other countries closed their borders, and therefore this one is called undesirable immigration. I hope that I awoke your interest in studying this for yourselves, because then you can also read in chapter 4 the abandonment of Argentina's Jews, and that is the next chapter, and even other chapters in this book, where it continues the extortion of the Jews in page 51, also going on for 12 pages. So I'm not going to read to you, of course, all these other chapters, but maybe I have awoken the interest of you to do your own studies in this field and to see how the whole world actually played together in a quote-unquote conspiracy to get the Jews persecuted, because it is the world that actually wants to replay Daniel's 70th week, because the world does not accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, as we Christians do. And they rather want to play their own Jesus, exactly as Jesus foretold when he said, "I have come in my Father's name and you accept me not. But there will come someone else in his own name, a name the Father did not give him, and him you will accept." Right? Jesus knew it all before. And who is that guy who comes in his own name? Well, that's the one that will come out of the Ratio Studiorum play of the Jesuits, of the quote-unquote unfulfilled 70th week of Daniel, that Jesus Christ, of course, completely fulfilled 2000 years ago. So, what's my point here? My point of reading this is that you have to understand that even though we are going deep into Argentina at this moment in this book, the United States of America also closed their borders, sent back ships that landed on their shores and wanted to, and was filled with Jewish refugees from Europe. England did the same, and other countries. And that's the reason why I'm reading this to you, especially in the light of what we read before and what we're going to read again in the next part of The Secret History of the Jesuits, because this is also part of it, and it is a very important part of this. So we have a few pages left. I'm going to retreat one paragraph to the top on page 36 and then continue in the book, and we're going to finish this chapter, Undesirable Immigration, today. The secret orders made it practically impossible for Jewish refugees to enter Argentina except through circuitous illegal routes. After 1941, hardly anybody else was able to get in, recalls Marcelo Fuhrmann, a Jew from Vienna whose brother had been among the last to slip into Argentina in 1938. He himself had to wait until after the war to obtain a visa. Immigration Office statistics back Fuhrmann up. The number of second and third class transatlantic passengers who were willing to state their religion as Jewish upon arrival in Buenos Aires plunged from 2006 in 1941 to a dismal 60 in 1942, falling further to only 26 in 1943 and to one solitary passenger by 1944. Both the US State Department and the British Foreign Office were aware of the widespread practice of selling visas to Jews. Quote, "Among the consular officers in Europe, such graft was the rule rather than the exception," unquote, the American Embassy in Buenos Aires reported in 1943. Although consuls took less than 1,000 pesos a case, officials at the Argentine Foreign Ministry received considerably large amounts. Businessman Adolfo Hirsch, president of the Jewish Philanthropic Society in Buenos Aires, which aided Jewish refugees arriving from Europe, told the American embassy that foreign ministry officials received up to 30,000 or 40,000 pesos to arrange for the entry of a group of Jewish refugees. The embassy had learned independently that the going rate was between 2,000 and 3,000 pesos for a single person and about 5,000 pesos for a married couple. Quote, "The immigration of the majority of refugees appears to be in violation of the strict Argentine immigration laws and regulations," unquote, the embassy reported. The British ambassador to Buenos Aires reported to London that bribes of between 5,000 and 10,000 pesos were going to a long chain of officials. This traffic, which has enriched many with influence in Argentine political circles from the president's immediate entourage to lesser officials in the Ministry of Agriculture, the police and the port authorities, has helped only those whose relatives were ready and able to pay bribes, Sir David Kelly wrote in April of 1943. The Argentine consul in Barcelona, Miguel Alfredo Molina, seems to have run a particularly brisk business. The American military attaché in Spain, Colonel Wendell G. Johnson, drafted a military intelligence report about his activities in October 1945. Molina was the longest-serving consul in Spain, having been first posted in Seville in 1928. An obviously intrepid character, he had acquired the passports of some 70 Argentines, looked upon as rats who had been detained at the Miranda prisoner of war and refugee camp, ostensibly to return them after checking their authenticity. But instead, Molina put the passports up for sale to Nazis and Jews indiscriminately. Colonel Johnson reported that the passports were selling for 35,000 pesetas each. Johnson was obviously alarmed by Molina's activities. He suggested that, quote, "there may be justification for an official protest to be made," unquote. Moreover, he had on his desk files on Molina that confirmed he was a close collaborator with the Nazis. A 1944 report showed that Molina had formed part of an espionage and smuggling organization involved in the transfer to Germany of vital war materials such as wolfram and platinum as well as gold. The diplomat rumored to have raised the largest amount of money from the Jews was also one of the most distinguished Argentina ever had. Miguel Ángel Carcano, while he was Argentina's ambassador to Paris from 1938 until the occupation by the Nazis, is said to have pocketed $1 million selling visas to rich Jews who sought refuge in France. His trade in visas was the talk of Argentina's diplomatic circles during the 1940s and 1950s. After Paris, Carcano served as ambassador in London until 1946, where he enjoyed great standing. Who served the greater good? The diplomats who were willing to stamp the passports of Jews in exchange for a bribe, or those who remained uncorrupted? Who served the greater good? The fact that Nazism gave rise to such unwholesome alternatives underlies the intrinsic evil of the system. In this case, those who took the bribes saved lives. Well, on the other hand, the people who couldn't pay bribes did not get saved. So, are we speaking about a quote-unquote greater good that anybody does who takes bribes to save Jews? No, I think that should be the case if someone does that without any bribes, out of quote-unquote no selfishness or brotherly love, as the Bible directs us to do, right? Prior to the coup he led on June 4th, 1943, Péron's writings reflected a fair degree of anti-Semitism. In May that year, 1943 that is, the colonel resorted with ease to a proto-Nazi vocabulary when he penned 2 strictly confidential reports for his secret GOU Lodge of Colonels. In a report on the domestic situation, he subscribed to the notion of a vast Jewish communist capitalist plot against Argentina, and found hidden forces and foreign agents of all types and with all kinds of purposes in charge of sabotage against the state. Unquote. Yeah, what do you think who these foreign agents of all types with all kinds of purposes in charge of sabotage against the state are? Those are Jesuits. These agents were, quote, in league with corrupt politicians, newspapers, Jews, foreign executives, etc., unquote. In short, the whole country has been penetrated. That's what the Jesuits do. They penetrate every country and take it out from the inside. Péron's analysis of the international situation claimed that the other South American nations who sided with the Allies had traded their independence for the Pope of had traded their independence for the hope of, quote, sharing in the spoils should the plutocracies manage to win the war, unquote, a victory he apparently deemed doubtful. In a train of thought which echoed Goyeneche's in the meetings he was holding in Europe, a considered Argentina's mediator in this conflict, believing that, quote, our neighbors are aware of the danger of an extraordinary growth in Argentina's influence should the Axis triumph, unquote. Okay, so before I continue reading, I want to explain to you 2 things that I just read. The one is the abbreviation GOU, which you probably don't understand because that is mentioned earlier in the book, but we only read this this chapter here. So I want to explain to you what GOU stands for. As it said here in the book, reports for his secret GOU Lodge of Colonels. Yeah? The GOU stands for a secret lodge of colonels led by Perón that ruled Argentina between 1943 and 1946. The initials are thought to have stood for Group of Order and Unity, GOU. And then I was mentioning in a train of thought which echoed Goyeneche's in the meetings he was holding in Europe. So we have to understand who is Goyeneche. And Goyeneche is Juan Carlos Goyeneche, Argentine Catholic nationalist and a special agent of Perón, connected to Fultner, Dyer and Guinea. During the war, Goyeneche met in Berlin with Ribbentrop, Himmler, Goebbels, and apparently Hitler himself, conveying news of Argentina's secret alliance to the Reich. Okay, so when we then read this last paragraph once again, it maybe makes a little bit more sense to you. I just thought of this because I, of course, came across these names and the abbreviation GOU in other chapters earlier in this book already, but you didn't, so I wanted to explain this to you. So now we're going to read this last paragraph once again. Péron's analysis of the international situation claimed that the other South American nations who sided with the Allies had traded their independence for the hope of sharing in the spoils should the plutocracies manage to win the war, a victory he apparently deemed doubtful. In a train of thought which echoed Goyeneche's in the meetings he was holding in Europe, he considered Argentina's mediator in this conflict, believing that our neighbors are aware of the danger of an extraordinary growth in Argentina's influence should the Axis triumph, unquote. This anti-Semitism carried over in the first internal memos of the GOU after the coup d'etat, when Perón got into power, which attacked Masonry as a Jewish creation, and the Rotary Club as a real network of Jewish international espionage and propaganda at the service of the United States. Now, here I can't help but make a comment. This anti-Semitism carried over in the first internal memos of the GOU. Yeah, we know the GOU to be, as I just read to you from the explanation of the that it is a secret lodge of colonels led by Peron, standing for the group of order and unity, that in the internal memos of the GOU after the coup, means after Peron got into power, which attacked Masonry as a Jewish creation. And everybody who studies a little bit and follows my videos knows, of course, that Masonry is not a Jewish creation but a Jesuit creation, and the Rotary Club as a real network of Jewish international espionage and propaganda at the service of the United States. No, the Rotary Club is the entrance level for Masonry, and also, of course, controlled by the Jesuits. Yeah, not Jewish, but Jesuits. But they blame the Jews herefore, and therefore they think they have a legitimate reason not to let Jews come into the country. That's the point here. According to the GOU, it was necessary to, quote, destroy the atomizing anti-Argentine germ of the diverse groups and entities at the service of the Jews and the communists, unquote. A nationalist document appended to these memos recommended banning the appointment of, quote, liberals or Masons or Rotarians, unquote, to government, and demanded that, quote, the accountant greffier, a Jew, who has recently been appointed by the overseer of the National Education Council, must also be immediately removed, unquote. So, they are putting all the Jesuit organizations, as we just read here, liberals or Masons or Rotarians, they put all these as inventions of the Jews, where they are, of course, inventions of the Jesuits. The Jews are to take the blame, and therefore they have to be immediately removed, as we read here. Okay? There is a reason why I want to include this chapter in the reading of the Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmond Paris, and I think it gets even more and more clear. By the way, working against liberals and Masons is taken straight out of the oath of the Knights of Columbus, which is very familiar to the oath of the Jesuits, except that where the Jesuits speak of liberals and Protestants, the Knight of Columbus oath speaks of liberals and Masons. Just a little side note. So continuing here. But for all his rhetoric in the secret GOU papers, Peron steered an even course when pressures from the more anti-Semitic members of his government later rocked the ship of state. Among these was the education minister, Gustavo Martinez Zuvivirira, who had published a string of anti-Semitic bestsellers under the pen name Hugo West, including the hugely successful novel 666. Sometime in 1943, the rumor began to circulate that a concentration camp for 10,000 Jews was being built by the GOU regime in the suburb of Muron, while others spoke of a concentration camp in the outlying forests of Odessa. There may have been some truth behind the whispers. A British intelligence agent, Abraham Bob Hamwee, had managed to secure the minutes of the GOU cabinet's meetings through bribery. He thus learned that certain ministers were pressuring for a, quote, solution to the Jewish problem, unquote, in Argentina. According to Hamwi's confidant, it was Perón who deflated their expectations. Quote, why kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, unquote, Perón had quipped. Nevertheless, the dictatorship proved even more adamantly opposed to aiding Jewish refugees than the previous civilian government. If Directive 11 was if Directive 11 was a difficult enough obstacle for Jews to surmount, the fence rose even higher after the 1943 coup that brought Perón into power. Although there was a succession of figurehead generals in the presidential seat, the colonels pulled the strings behind the scenes, and the puppet master was, of course, Colonel Perón. Now, before I continue, of course I assume that you understand that when a civilian government in Argentina that already was against Jewish immigration was overthrown by a coup d'etat in 1943 by Colonel Perón and his group of colonels, you understand, I assume, that the Jesuits are all behind this, right? I mean, I don't have to explain every little detail in that way to you, I guess. Quote, the consensus of persons active in Jewish rescue and relief work is that so long as the present regime remains in power, no assistance whatsoever can be expected from the Argentine government in refugee matters, unquote, the American embassy in Buenos Aires reported to President Roosevelt's newly created War Refugee Board on 21st of April 1944. The colonels appointed the Nazi-trained, skull-measuring anthropologist Santiago Peralta to head immigration. Nazi-trained? Jesuit-trained. Born in the northern wine-producing province of Mendoza in 1887, Peralta moved with his family to Buenos Aires as a young boy, where he earned a degree in anthropology at the School of Philosophy. Greek studies, Jesuit studies. In 1922 he began applying his measuring tape to the bodies of army conscripts for an anthropological study on military bearing. Later he became a school inspector and traveled as far as the Jewish colonies in the northern province of Entre Rios. By 1932 he was studying applied anthropology in Germany. Applied anthropology studying in Germany during the time of the Third Reich, because that started a year later, 1933, you can also replace the word anthropology by eugenics. Many details of his life remain obscure, but one thing is clear enough. Peralta was a Nazi, is the succinct description provided by one of his successors at immigration, Hector Chiapuscio. According to this account, Peralta was connected to military intelligence. Even into the early 1960s, Chiapuscio, as head of immigration, was badgered covertly on Peralta's behalf to try to block immigration from Japan and the Soviet Union. The virulently anti-Semitic book Peralta published in 1943, The Action of the Jewish People in Argentina, was the title, reveals a plodding, schematic, militaristic brain and could almost serve on its own as sufficient proof that racism breeds from ignorance. It remains perhaps the most violent anti-Semitic tract ever published in Argentina, appearing at a moment when news of the Nazi concentration camps was becoming public knowledge worldwide. Deeply paranoid, Peralta feared a Jewish conspiracy was planning to turn his beloved country into a new homeland for the displaced Jews of Europe. Quote, the immigration office the immigration office has been in their hands for a long time, unquote, wrote Perón's race expert. Quote, They are the ones who instated ignorant, barbaric leaders and brought about the cessation of European immigration so that they could remain the only settlers. This strange turn of events coincided with the fall of the Jewish regime in Germany. They needed a new homeland for the persecuted from Germany, and that place was our country. And the slow, silent ride of poor Jewish immigrants continues as the Argentines find excitement in Negro music, tropical dancing, and American cinema." Unquote. And so it goes on, page upon page of quasi-scientific theory and the jumble of anti-Semitic stereotypes that clearly teemed inside Peralta's head. Now let me just retreat to this one sentence in the quote that says, "This strange turn of events coincided with the fall of the Jewish regime in Germany." When was there ever a Jewish regime in Germany? I don't claim to know all of German history, but I know that there never was a Jewish regime in Germany. Never, ever. Peralta's Peralta's career flourished despite his anti-Semitism, and when Perón assumed office as democratically elected president on the 4th of June 1946, a few years after his coup d'etat, he confirmed Peralta in his post, raising a clamor of protest from liberal sectors and the Jewish community. Most mind-boggling of all, in 1946 Peralta returned to the charge with his second wildly anti-Semitic book. In The Influence of the Arab People in Argentina, he contrasted the benefits of promoting Arab immigration against the disadvantages of admitting the Jews. So, let in the Muslims and throw out the Jews. The Jews, quote, "lodge like a cyst in the people where they establish themselves, and the only relationship they require is the commercial contact to exploit them." Unquote. He subscribed to the notion that the Jews should be punished for the crucifixion of Jesus, who preached love, sweetness, and paternity among men, against the religion of Jehovah, which was one of punishment, hatred, and fear. I mean, can you get it? How deceived these people are? How can you make the religion of Jehovah different from the religion of Jesus Christ? What they say here actually is that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. Why? Because they don't understand why quote-unquote Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, was a God of punishment. He was not a God of punishment. He was a God that put rules on people, the same as Jesus Christ. Yeah? I mean, I don't even want to get started on this, because this is a whole subject on its own. I just want to ask you for your own biblical discernment when I read this to you. Yeah? When he says here, first and for all, the notion that the Jews should be punished for the crucifixion of Jesus. The Jews didn't crucify Jesus. It was the Romans. It was the Romans that crucified Jesus Christ. The Jews wanted him to get crucified, I know, but they didn't do it. They didn't do it. So that already is wrong. And of course it is correct that he says that Jesus preached love, sweetness, and paternity among men against the religion of Jehovah. I'm sorry? No. But that is a wrong understanding from the Old Testament. I really can't go into this, because this would be a whole video series of itself, to explain to people that the religion of Jehovah, quote unquote, yeah, is the same as the religion of Jesus Christ. God never changes. It's only our misunderstanding, or not our, but the misunderstanding of many people who just don't get it. And that, of course, for propaganda services or for propaganda reasons, like this Peralta in his anti-Semitic book, the second book already. The action of the Jewish people in Argentina being one, and the influence of the Arab people in Argentina being the second anti-Semitic book Peralta wrote. He studied philanthropy in Germany, which is eugenics, which is against the races, which is to exterminate certain people from the face of the earth. That is something that we have to understand. The author says here, Peralta's pen oozed Nazi venom. Yeah, absolutely. The Jews were a quote-unquote parasitic plant, backed by, quote, great empires of foreign money, unquote, and by deranged governments. They exploit the whole Argentine people. All this published by the head of immigration, while the Nuremberg trials were getting underway in Germany. Quote, we won't make racist distinctions, but we will choose the best within the white race to create the Argentine we all yearn for, quote, unquote, he said with a straight face to the press at the time. Speaking of Peralta. Speaking of his convictions of anti-Semitism. Okay? Peralta's pen oozed Nazi venom. The Jews were a parasitic plant, backed by great empires of foreign money. Well, what is that foreign money, please, Peralta? He doesn't go into that. I go into that. That foreign money is the money from the Vatican banks, is from the Vatican. Because, as we know, Jews like the Rothschilds are nothing else but the guardians of the Vatican treasure. And that means that they have all the money of the Vatican at their disposal to do as they please. And because those Jews are Hofjuden and are obedient only to the Pope and the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, they want to exterminate their own race. I don't have to get into all this again. I just want to tell you that when reading this book, and even reading this little chapter of this book, The Real Odessa by Yuki Goni, we can have a great understanding of how this quote-unquote anti-Semitism grew all around the world, especially in this case in Argentina. But let me assure you, that was in other countries no different. That was no different. That's why they closed the borders to the fleeing Jews. Huh? We won't make racist distinctions, Peralta says here, but we will choose the best within the white race to create the Argentine we all yearn for. So what is that but eugenics? In mid-1946, on the eve of Perón's presidential inauguration, the SS Jamaica docked at the port of Buenos Aires with 70 Jews on board. Peralta refused to let them land. Jewish organizations were incensed, and a storm of public protest erupted a few days later when Perón assumed the presidency. Voices cried out demanding Peralta's resignation. The press carried daily notices reminding Perón that Peralta was still in office and asking how much longer he would remain. Quote, the permanence of an anti-Semite at the head of immigration office is an insult to the country, unquote, thundered the prestigious weekly Gobernantes. The New York Times carried an editorial on the Jamaica affair. Do you know what I think is most astounding about this reading, this little paragraph here for the third time mentioning that after the elections of Perón, his presidential inauguration after elections, so first you make a coup d'etat, means that you make a military strike to overthrow a legitimate government to come into power yourself, then you call out elections, and of course because these elections are rigged, you are getting your legitimacy to become a quote-unquote selected or elected president. Ain't that a joke? Continuing. During the crucial first year after the end of the war, Peralta mounted guard at the gates of Argentina, refusing admittance to Jews. The Jamaica incident did not occur in a vacuum. Already in late 1945, Peralta's attitude had frustrated the leaders of international Jewish rescue groups who had visited Buenos Aires. When they pleaded with him to grant Jews already in Argentina permission to bring their children, spouses, siblings and parents over to join them, Peralta remained unmoved, and renewed pleas in 1946 were equally unsuccessful. The matter clearly had to be taken to the leader, means Perón, himself. Toward the middle of November 1946, therefore, a group of 10 Jewish community representatives entered the presidential office. The issues were laid out on the table. Jewish immigration was blocked. Peralta refused to make exceptions for the reunification of Jewish families, even for next of kin. Perón was non-committal. He promised to investigate. As it turned out, he did nothing. What was on Perón's mind during such meetings with the Jewish leaders? Fortunately, we know, for he discussed the Jewish problem with the fugitive Nazis he gave refuge to. Quote, "I remember one of the Germans who came to Argentina after their defeat talking to me about the Jewish problem," Perón recalled in memoirs he privately dictated into a cassette recorder during his exile in Madrid in the late 1960s. Quote, "How do you figure I'm going to get involved in that mess of the Jewish problem when you know very well that Hitler, with his 100 million inhabitants, couldn't solve it? What am I going to do with 20 or 25 million Argentines?" Unquote, Perón asked the German. Quote, "If the Jews live here, we can't kill them. And we can't expel them either. There is no solution but putting them to work inside the community, preventing them from forming separate Zionist organizations." Unquote. The president shared Peralta's preference for the Arabs, as the tapes show. Quote, "I was great friends with the Arab community because it was a community that was Peronist at heart. The Jews were in it out of self-interest. I had Arab legislators, senators, governors. In my judgment, the Arabs have this superiority over the Jews, that they adapt more easily, they grow roots, they meld into the culture, while the Jew is always a stranger. He doesn't integrate. Maybe it's a question of race or religion, but that's how it is." Unquote. Perón never did dismantle the noxious bureaucracy acting against the Jews. Instead, he made it work in his favor. Jews started being admitted on a case-by-case basis through the personal intercession of good guy Perón, with Peralta playing the bad guy. On 14th of February 1947, the SS Campana docked at the port of Buenos Aires with 47 Holocaust survivors on board. Peralta again refused to allow the Jews to disembark. The president of the DAIA Jewish organization appealed directly to Perón, catching him off guard during a meeting with Jewish leaders interested in forming a Peronist organization. Perón listened to the plea put forward by Moises Goldman and ordered the acceptance of the Holocaust survivors. The passengers were released in a blaze of media attention and taken to the presidential mansion to thank Perón personally. Perón wasn't in, but they were received by one of his ministers. The Jewish press was ecstatic, believing that a turning point had been reached. But Perón's move was not humanitarian, and time proved the Campana gesture to be an isolated political act. That same week, Perón had managed to split the Jewish community in half, creating the loyal Argentine Israelite organization, OIA, that received favors from him and his wife Evita. Among the prizes OIA eventually gained for its Peronist loyalty were landing permits, which it could brandish as trophies before other members of the Jewish community. The older, more traditional and independent DAIA received only scraps from Peron's table from now on. Quote, "When you include him in business, the Jew enters into it. The Jew is, above everything else, a bargainer," unquote, Peron confided to his tape recorder in Madrid. An angry Peralta affixed a court note to the passenger list of the Campana, making it clear that it was only, quote, "in the name of the most excellent president of the nation that he was making an unquote unquote exception this time and allowing the 47 Jews to disembark." But the restrictions that made Peralta's exception possible were held firmly in place by Peron. Nonetheless, demands for Peralta's resignation continued to grow. Goldman of the DAIA met with Peron twice in March and April 1947 to plead for 12 Jewish refugees with transit visas to Paraguay. Political turmoil in that country prevented their going any further, and Peralta had ordered their return to Europe. The following months, 14 more refugees were held on board ship for 3 weeks, and it was only public opinion that the United States had that forced Peralta to relent. At the United Nations, the interception of a secret memo instructing Argentine consuls to deny visas to Jews became an issue. Then, a Jewish businessman who met with Peralta to plead for a landing permit for his brother was told to pack his bags and leave, while he and the Jewish community still had time. An official protest was lodged by the Jewish aid and rescue groups. Finally, in June 1947, Peron bowed to the pressure and Peralta was dismissed. Yet, somehow, despite the closing of the gates, part of the wave of humanity expelled from occupied Europe managed to percolate to Argentina. Estimates vary, especially in a country with such deliberately patchy record-keeping, but between 20,000 and 30,000 Jews are believed to have found new home in Argentina between 1933 and 1945. A final tally may ultimately prove impossible because the secret directives forced most Jews to enter illegally. For 1942 to 1945, for example, there exist only 240 documented cases of legal Jewish entries. Yet figures from some Jewish rescue groups place the total for that period as high as 4,460. The possibility that some of these groups may have inflated their figures to boost donations indicates how thorny the issue is and what pitfalls await the researcher. Even this low number is higher than those for other countries in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States. Read this again. Even this low number, 4,460, is higher than those for other countries in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States of America. So that means that the United States of America has admitted much less than 4,460 Jewish refugees during the persecution in Europe into their own country. This, however, reflects no merit on Argentina's part. No, Argentina does not appear in a better light because maybe other states even are worse. The vast majority of Jews who arrived either managed to pass themselves off as Catholics or could afford to pay the heavy bribes demanded by Argentine diplomats and immigration officials. Whatever the final number, it will still be abysmally low compared with how many could have been saved, and Argentina not implemented its secret policy against the Jews with such rigor. How many thousands more could have been rescued if any measure of generosity and basic human decency had been applied by the bureaucrats of Buenos Aires? And this is where chapter 3 of the real Odessa, Undesirable Immigration, comes to a conclusion. Of course, the book continues in chapter 4, the abandonment of Argentina's Jews, and as I told you in the beginning, that is maybe very interesting for you to do your own research. But this is the moment where we will turn back to the original book reading, The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmond Paris, and we will continue in chapter 7, The Jesuits at the Collequim Russicum. So, amongst the various causes which decided the Vatican to start the First World War, by urging the Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph, to, quote, chastise the Serbians, unquote, the main one was, as we have seen, to strike a decisive blow against the Orthodox Church, his hated and centuries-old rival. Beyond the small Serbian nation, the Vatican aimed at Russia, the traditional protector of Orthodox believers in the Balkans and the East. You have to know, of course, I think we spoke about this earlier in this book, that the Tsar of Russia was the protector of the Orthodox Church, and that is also one of the reasons why he had to go with this quote-unquote Bolshevik revolution and, of course, implementing Soviet Russia or Soviet Union and communism in that country. Pierre Dominique wrote, quote, to Rome this affair became most important. A victory of apostolic monarchy over Tsarism could be looked upon as a victory of Rome over the schism of the East, speaking of the schism of 1054. The Roman Curia was in no way concerned that such a victory could only be acquired through a gigantic holocaust. The risk, rather than the certainty of it, was accepted, as the alliances made it unavoidable. Urged by his Secretary of State, the Jesuit Merry del Val, Pius X made no secret of it, and the Bavarian chargé d'affaires wrote to his government on the eve of the conflict, quote, he, the Pope, does not think the French and Russian armies would be successful in a war against Germany, unquote. This wicked calculation proved wrong. The First World War, which ravaged the north of France and left several millions dead, did not fulfill Rome's ambitions. It divided Austria-Hungary instead, so depriving the Vatican of its main stronghold in Europe and liberating the Slavs who were a part of that double monarchy from Vienna's apostolic yoke. In addition, the Russian Revolution liberated from the Vatican's control those Roman Catholics, for the most part of Polish origins, who lived in the Tsar's former empire. The defeat was total, but the Roman Church, patiens quia aeterna, was going to pursue with fresh efforts her politics of the Drang nach Osten, means the urge to the east, the thrust toward the east, which combined so well with the pan-German ambitions. For that, as we mentioned earlier on, the raising up of dictators and the Second World War with its retinue of horrors, the cleaning up of the Warthland in Poland, and the compulsory Catholicization of Croatia were two examples, especially atrocious, of these horrors. It was of no importance that 25 millions died in concentration camps, 32 million soldiers were killed on the battlefields, and 29 millions were wounded and maimed. These are the official statistics of the United Nations organization and show the magnitude of that carnage. This time, the Roman Curia thought her aims had been reached, and one could read in Basler Nachrichten of Basel, quote, the German action in Russia poses the question of that country's evangelization. The Vatican is most highly interested in it, unquote. And this from a book devoted to the glorification of Antichrist Pope Pius XII, quote, the Vatican and Berlin signed a pact allowing the Catholic missionaries of the Russicum College to go to occupied territories and the placing of the Baltic territories under Berlin's nunciature. unquote. The quote-unquote Catholicization of Russia was about to be launched under the protection of the Wehrmacht and SS in the manner Pavelic and his associates were carrying out in Croatia, but on a much vaster scale. This was indeed a triumph for Rome, and there you can see how Germany was used as the battle axe of the Vatican. What disappointment then when the Hitlerian thrust was stopped at Moscow, and when von Paulus and his army were trapped in Stalingrad. It was Christmas time, Christmas of 1942, and one must reread the message, rather than vibrant call to arms, addressed to the Christian nations by the Holy Father, Christian nations being in quotation marks because we are speaking about Catholic nations. Quote, "This is not a time for lamentation, but action. May the Crusades' enthusiasm get hold of Christianity, and the call of God once it will be heard. May we be ready to serve and sacrifice ourselves as the Crusaders of old." Unquote. Now, when you really want to understand this, you have to read this a little bit different. This is not a time for lamentation, but action. May the Crusades' enthusiasm get hold of Catholicism, and the call of Satan once it will be heard. May we be ready to serve and sacrifice ourselves as the Crusaders of old. We exhort and implore you to take upon yourselves the awful gravity of the present situation. As for the volunteers who participate in this holy crusade of modern times, quote, "Raise the standard high, declare war on the darkness of a world separated from God." Unquote. On this day of the Nativity, we were far from Pax Christi. On this day of the Nativity, speaking about Christmas, that is the birthday of the God of the unconquerable Sun, the Sun God. That is the birthday of 25th of December, not the birthday of Jesus Christ, the Savior of mankind. This warlike address was not the expression of the strict neutrality the Vatican flatters itself to observe in international matters. This address was made even more improper by the fact that Russia was the ally of England, America, and Free France. We smile while reading the vehement contestation of Pius XII's thurifiers, who tell us that Hitler's war was not a real crusade, when that word is mentioned in the Holy Father's message. The volunteers the Pope called to arms were those of the Azul Division, and those recruited by Cardinal Baudrillard in Paris. Quote, "Hitler's war is a noble enterprise in the defense of European culture." Unquote. Baudrillard exclaimed on the 30th of July 1941. We note, though, that the Vatican is not interested anymore in the defense of this culture now that it strives to make African nations revolt against France. Antichrist Pope Pius XII said, quote, "The Catholic Church does not identify herself with Western culture." Unquote. No? What is today where we all over Europe defend the quote-unquote Western culture in the name of Catholicism? What a turnaround, eh? The impostures and gross contradictions are endless on the part of those who accuse Satan of being the father of all lies. The defeat sustained in Russia by Hitler's armies, these noble defenders of European culture, involved also the Jesuit converters. One wonders what Saint Teresa was doing before such a disaster. Antichrist Pope Pius XI had proclaimed her, Saint Teresa, patron saint of unfortunate Russia, and Canon Kube represented her standing, quote, "smiling, but as terrible as an army set for battle against the Bolshevist giant." Unquote. Had the saint of Lisieux, used for all kinds of work by the Church, succumbed under the new and gigantic task assigned to her by the Holy Lather, it would not be surprising. But instead of the little saint, there was still the Queen of Heaven, who had taken upon herself in 1917 already under certain conditions to bring back schismatic Russia to the Roman Church's fold. Now, again, we have this Queen of Heaven here. We have a apparition, yeah, that took place in 1917 in Russia of the quote-unquote Virgin Mary, the Queen of Heaven, which is nothing else but Semiramis. And don't get me wrong, I do not doubt that these apparitions happened. I'm only sure about that these apparitions are actually apparitions of demons. Yeah? The ministers of Satan, the helpers of the spirit of the air, or the god of this world, as he is also called in the New Testament. This Queen of Heaven made some very interesting quotes, and if you want to learn more about those, I have to tell you that you should go to, let's see, I have to find on my new PC still all the links that I actually use. No, I don't need the videos here. This I wanted to have. Okay, Queen. And again, I mentioned this book earlier, but here it is in the picture for you so that you can see it for yourself. Queen of Rome, Queen of Islam, Queen of all. The Marian apparitions plan to unite all religions under the Roman Catholic Church. And why does it unite all religions, like the Islamic religion and the Catholic religion? Well, because they are of the same roots, as we learn when we read The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, or Babylon Mystery Religion by Ralph Woodrow, which I uploaded on my channel. But very important that you get this book, and you can download this for free. eternalproductions.org PDFs Queen PDF. So when you Google Queen of Rome, Queen of Islam, Queen of all PDF, you will be led to that link and you can download this book. And this is a wonderful book that Tom Frass read in 2009 on Inquisition Update. This is from 2006, and I have planned to read this. And as you can see here, when we go through the table of contents, those are very interesting chapters to read about, and then you will have a much better understanding of how the Queen of Heaven is being used to deceive the whole world into a one-world religion. Okay? So, but instead of the little saint, there was still the Queen of Heaven, who had taken upon herself in 1917 already, under certain conditions, to bring back schismatic Russia to the Roman Church's fold. Let us read what Lacroix said about it, and it was not in Russia in appearance, I'm sorry, it was in Portugal. It was the Virgin of Fatima. Yeah? Quote, "We will remind our readers that the Virgin of Fatima had herself promised," and Virgin of Fatima, Fatima is one of the isn't she one of the daughters of Muhammad? Yeah. That the Virgin of Fatima had herself promised the conversion of the Russians if all Christians sincerely and joyfully practiced all the commandments of the evangelical law. Now, we have to understand that this sentence, of course, here in the latter part must read, if all Catholics sincerely and joyfully practice the commandments of Roman Catholic canon law. That's the way we should read and understand this. Okay? We want to point out that, according to the Jesuit fathers, who are great specialists in miraculous matters, the celestial mediator recommended as especially affected the daily use of the rosary. Well, the use of the rosary is not in the Bible. It is a man-made tradition. And what did Jesus Christ have to say about man-made traditions? You scribes and Pharisees prevent people to go to heaven because you can't in by yourself, because you deceive them with your vain man-made traditions. This promise from the Virgin had even been sealed by a, quote, dance of the sun, unquote, a wonder which occurred again in 1951 in the gardens of the Vatican for the benefit of, quote unquote, His Holiness, not quote, Antichrist Pope Pius XII only. So the sun did a special performance only for the Antichrist. Nevertheless, the Russians entered Berlin in spite of the crusade called for by the Pope, and until now the fellow countrymen of Mr. Khrushchev have not shown any eagerness, as far as we know, to appear before the doors of St. Peter in penitent garb with the halters around their necks. What went wrong? Had Christians not told sufficient heads on their rosaries? Were heaven's requisite number of tens not fulfilled? We would be tempted to believe this to be the cause if there wasn't that rather scabrous detail in that wonderful story of Fatima. The promise of Russia's conversion, sensibly given to the clairvoyant Lucia in 1917, was revealed by her in 1941 only, when she had become a nun, and made public in October 1942 by Cardinal Schuster, a keen partisan of the Rome-Berlin axis. It was made public by a request, or shall we say order, from Antichrist Pope Pius XII, this same Pius XII who, 3 months later, expressed the aforementioned call for crusade. I'm gonna stop this reading here, because we've reached about an hour now, and I'm gonna continue next time in this wonderful chapter 7 of The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmond Paris, and I hope that you appreciate the excursus we did on the book of Ukigoni, the real Odessa, and that you see how all these things come together, and that you were edified by it and that you learned of it. That is my hope and that is my prayer. For today, for this video, I'll leave it with this. This was the 27th part of Secret History of the Jesuits, and next time we will continue reading in that chapter 7 of the Russian Collequim that we just started. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, thanks for commenting, and until next time, may God bless you, and bye-bye.
Especially I work in dealing with the infiltration of churches and religious institutions as well as government. That cover a tremendous number of institutions.
And the purpose of that infiltration was what for?
Well, the purpose is what the Roman Catholic system has all the time as her own purpose, is to infiltrate, to penetrate all the areas of life where the Roman Catholic can have control and access for the coming world government.
Simply put, this country and this world benefit from your commitment to Jesuit principles, to being men.
As a graduate of another great Jesuit institution, Xavier University, I have great affection for the value and purpose of a Jesuit education.
What that means is, in preparation for that world government, the Roman Catholic institution, especially since the establishment of the Jesuit order in 1541, throughout all these 500 years, they've been in preparation and through infiltration and penetration of every level of society in order to take over the world politically and religiously.
What a beautiful day the Lord has made. Holy Father, on behalf of Michelle and myself, welcome to the White House.
There are two doctrines that define very well these dangerous goals of the Roman Catholic institution. Two doctrines define this very well. One is called the doctrine of the apostolic succession, and that is dealing with the papacy. And the other is the doctrine, the temporal power, and that is dealing with world government. Of course, both because you can see that even the Pope and his own individual office, he meet those requirements. He is not only the head of his church, as he called himself, John Paul II, the present Pope. He said he is the pastor of his church. He is not only that, but he is the head of his state.
It is a sign, perhaps, of how far we have come in this country that today's news of formal recognition between the governments of the United States and the Vatican did not create a furor. Once upon a time, it would have. Once upon a time, and not all that long ago, it did.
From the time of President Washington, that was the first president to be utilized by the Jesuits. If you were not aware of that, President Washington already was initiated by the Jesuits to bring about the first communication with the Vatican ever known in this country. From there on, President Reagan, to all this time, President Reagan has come to fulfill the greatest moment in the history of this conspiracy.